The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Sullivan, and I'd like to welcome you to the Dignity in Schools campaign webinar on using DSC's accountability guidelines on school pushout in charter schools. During the webinar, all participants will be on mute. At the start of the webinar, we'll hear from 4 speakers, and during that time, participants will stay on mute but can still ask questions by typing them into the question box on your control panel. And I'll keep a list of those questions and can ask them during the Q&A period. After the presentations, once we reach the Q&A portion of the webinar, in order to ask a question, you can either raise your hand by pushing the hand icon on the upper right side of your control panel, and I can then unmute your audio so that you can ask a question, or you can still type questions into the question box, and I can read them aloud for the presenters. Just another reminder for anyone who's joining through their phone line, be sure to enter your audio PIN so that I can unmute you through the control panel. So once again, welcome to the webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Fernando Martinez, our field organizer, to get us started.
Thank you, Liz. And I hope everybody's doing okay this wonderful afternoon, at least in North Carolina. And again, welcome to the Accountability Guidelines on the School Push-Out and Charter Schools webinar, and specifically how to use it on local work. We will have some examples. The way we're going to do this, or the agenda for today, is pretty much has been structured in 4 areas. One will be learning a little bit about the Dignity in Schools campaign for those folks that join probably the first time and don't know much about the Dignity in Schools campaigns. And also we will share with you why a coalition that mainly focuses on school push-out and disciplines actually is taking this work around accountabilities for charter schools as well. The second part of the agenda will be pretty much, and that part of the agenda will be, the first one will be facilitated by me, obviously, the DSC staff, and the second one will be facilitated by Harold Jordan, a senior policy advocate with the American Civil Liberties Unions in Pennsylvania, ACLU Pennsylvania. And Harold pretty much is going to do a quick overview of the document and how we structure the document. And but we focus mainly on 2 of the principles, the right to dignity and the freedom from discrimination, and also how to use the accountability standards in your local work, in your local campaign. The third part of the agenda, the third part of the webinar is pretty much around case studies and some examples of what is going on in New Orleans and also in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. So we will hear specifically from members from New Orleans around how and what's going on with the landscaping and with charter schools in New Orleans and also in Philadelphia. And the last part, obviously, is to take questions and answers, so you can engage with participants and we can elaborate and learn from each other as well. So that is pretty much what we have for you today. That's our agenda. And with that, I like to officially get this webinar started. And I wanted to share with you about the Dignity in Schools campaign, who we are and where we are organizing. We are a national grassroots coalition of about 91 members in 23 states and the District of Columbia, and we come together to challenge the systematic problem of push-outs and to advocate for the human right of every young person to education and dignity. And the Dignity in Schools campaign is talking about the charter schools. Why will be the Dignity in Schools campaign talking about charter schools? And the primary reason is because our members ask for it. So as anything with Dignity in Schools campaign, we, like I said, we are a grassroots coalition, and anything we do actually is in response to members' need and in order to help them to build the capacity. So for a while, when we do our local work and our organizing, I keep hearing, and other DSC staff keep hearing from members around, do we have anything for any guidelines for how charter school can deal with discipline in a way that is going to keep the students in and don't push them out. So the primary reason is to develop this as a tool for our members to present to policymakers and charter school leaders on how to deal with the discipline and how to reduce push out and increase definitely accountability on charter school, specifically around the discipline part. The other reason is to promote the best practices that encourage inclusive and positive school discipline practices and dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, which is our long-term goal. And definitely to encourage organizers, advocates, and decision makers, and a variety of groups that are doing work around discipline and around educational issues. But we really want to encourage them to examine the particular state laws and the practices related to charter schools and how they are dealing with discipline as well. And the last reason that is listed in here at least, because we have many other reasons that come out with this document, is to address the systematic factor that drive push out related to charter schools, not in a way that pass judgment on families who decide charter school is the best choice for their child, because as we do this work, we know that parents really want the best for their children, and we really are not trying to pass any judgment on any particular family that is choosing the best for the children, the best education for them. But at the same time, we wanted to have these guidelines, like I said, as a tool for organizers and advocates to hold charter schools accountable when it comes to discipline and the push-out problem that this country is facing. It was a process. It was a long process, and pretty much we developed these guidelines in probably around 1 year, probably more or less, in which we held many conference calls with members around, different reasons why we needed to come up with these charter school guidelines. And also we did survey the members many times. We make individual phone calls to members around, their local work and how they are either facing challenges or working in partnership and relationship with charter schools as well. But also we did a lot of this work at the annual membership meeting when we got together in Washington, D.C. early this year, and we did it face-to-face, and members actually were able to review and to give us feedback on the document at the annual membership meeting. We, since then, we continue the conference calls and doing the edits and improving the document, and we released them finally on I think it was October 7 in Dayton, Ohio, during the annual the National Week of Action on the School Push-Out, which we've been doing for about 5 years in order to raise awareness on the school push-out problem. Our member, Racial Justice Now, in Dayton, Ohio, actually prepared a report card on discipline for all public schools in Ohio, but specifically the day of the release, they focus their energies on how charter schools are dealing with discipline. They kind of like pull the whole report card from the state to specifically show how charter schools are dealing with discipline. And also it was released during the same event, like I said, in Dayton, Ohio. We also had members from New Orleans, from FLIC, and also from Boston, from Massachusetts, that actually joined the press conference and the event, and also they shared their experiences around discipline issues in their charter schools as well. And that's pretty much, what I wanted to share with you. But if you have questions, we're going to be able to address those questions at the end. And I'd like to invite Harold Jordan to continue sharing about the document.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Harold Jordan from the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania. I live here in Philadelphia. Actually, my kids went through the Philadelphia public school systems, and I used to be an administrator in the system. In a town where about a third of all students attending publicly funded schools go to charters, which has been a rapid sort of expansion within the last 6 years, mostly. As you know, the charter movement has become quite controversial. And when I say charter movement, I don't mean specific well-functioning charters, but the movement as a whole. What's its impact on the funding of regular public schools? There's some evidence that the expansion of charters is leading to increased segregation. Do charters function well academically? Are they publicly accountable in any way? For example, do charters make available minutes of their board meetings? Do they respond to public records requests? There have been significant problems in all of these areas, but these are some of the controversies about charters. At the Dignity in Schools campaign, our focus is on accountability. And in fact, some of the key features of charters make public accountability more challenging. This is especially true in the arenas of discipline and student assignment. But charters are public schools that are independently run of the regular school system but receive public funds. In most states, they operate under special laws and are not subject to all of the provisions of the Education Code. But they are still publicly funded schools, and we have to hold them accountable. With that in mind, DSC member organizations came together to develop a document that spells out what some of those mechanisms of accountability might be. That document covers 5 issues: the right to an education, access to quality education for all students, equitable distribution of resources, including avoiding promoting charters at the expense of underfunding public schools, other public schools, the right to participation, meaningful parent and student say, and broader community participation in decision-making about charters, the right to dignity, which is our way of saying discipline, a fair and appropriate discipline, including embracing alternative strategies, the right to freedom from discrimination, which mostly focuses on enrollment practices and avoiding and addressing racial disparities in school discipline. And then, of course, in order for anything to work right, you have to monitor it, make sure that there is appropriate oversight. And that's the 5th area. What I'm going to focus on today are 2 specific areas: the right to dignity and the right to freedom from discrimination. So, as I said, when we talk about dignity within the DSC context, we are often talking about issues of discipline and matters related to discipline. There are some challenges that are built into this. Fernando, if you can skip to the challenges, thank you. First is that charters have their own codes of student conduct. These are often more restrictive than other public schools. Restrictive in terms of clothing rules, hair rules, attendance rules, and some other rules. Sometimes cell phone policies are more restrictive, but they tend to be more restrictive. Often due process and discipline is inadequate or non-existent, even when it comes to very serious forms of discipline. Practices, sometimes informal practices, of pushing students out of charters into public schools or into alternative schools in lieu of appropriate intervention and due process is a very, very big issue. And that includes the practice of counseling students out of schools, saying, okay, we could put you through a discipline process, but instead, hey, can your parent just, or guardian, withdraw you and send you to the regular public school? Then you won't have discipline, you won't have a disciplinary record. But that also means that students are denied due process, and that's an important thing. The federal government is well aware of some of the problems presented by the Charter Governance Framework, and I call folks' attention to it. And later on, a few slides down, I present the link to the Federal Education Department's Dear Colleague letter on charters, which came out in May of this year, which addresses many of the same issues that we addressed in the DSC document: non-discrimination at admissions and discipline. And that means that folks have to have an understanding of, have basic information about how charters function, how one gets into a charter, what the process is, that there's not discrimination in the selection process, the selection and assignment process. Once again, due process and discipline, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a second. And that means the same thing it means in a regular public school, that kids be treated fairly and that kids be given have the right to a fair process. free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. That speaks to the services that must be provided so that that student's individual educational needs are as adequately met as students without disabilities. That's the basic idea. And then affirmative steps for English language learners. Those are just the 5 issues that are addressed in the Federal Department of Education Dear Colleague letter. And they parallel very nicely what we talk about in our accountability guidelines. I want to focus a little bit more on what we say in Dignity in Schools in these accountability guidelines about the right to dignity. That is our euphemism for work in the discipline arena. What we're promoting is non-discrimination in discipline and an understanding by charter schools that they must be in compliance with all federal civil rights policies and with the Department of Education and Department of Justice discipline guidance that came out in January. That's very, very critical that charters and charter networks be held accountable in that arena. That they must adopt those codes of conduct that are consistent with the federal discipline guidance and with the DSC model code. And that means that it must be graduated, it must have alternatives, and it must have due process. Thirdly, we call for ending the informal push-out practices, such as what I mentioned before, counseling kids out or other kinds of things that are done. A fourth area is the prohibition on the use of disciplinary fines. Now, although this practice is not widespread across the country, there have been many notorious incidents in which a charter school basically fines a kid for a certain infraction. So the best known case is the Noble network of charter schools in Chicago, where kids were fined $3 for chewing gum and up to almost $300 for classroom disruption. The Noble network brought in $200,000 in disciplinary fines in the year 2011. This practice became so controversial that it was supposedly changed earlier this year in 2014. Chicago people need to monitor that to see that it in fact has been done. We also call for due process and spell out some of the specifics of what that means and what that involves. And then finally, students who are removed from school through long-term suspension or even short-term suspension or expulsion should receive educational services rather than just being dumped on the street. The second area I want to focus on that we address in the DSC accountability guidelines is the right to freedom from discrimination. Here we focus on ending discriminatory enrollment and selection practices so that information be provided. This is very close to what the federal government says in the Department of Ed Dear Colleagues letter that was issued in May, that information must be provided to the broad public, not just the selected public, that it be transparent, that the processes be non-burdensome, the application process, and that the selection process not be discriminatory. Let me give you an example of a problem. We know of charter schools where you can enroll your kid if you pick up the application on one particular day, or something, you know, that's so narrow and so restrictive that most people could not apply to charter schools if they wanted to. But there are actual instances of where the application sort of window is so narrow that it essentially excludes charter schools, excludes many families from charter schools who might otherwise be interested. Charters must provide appropriate services for students with disabilities, English language learners, and students with other needs. Once again, what we say here is close to what the federal government has said. I think the Dignity in Schools campaign adds to it a little bit by saying that they have responsibilities toward homeless students and students living in temporary housing, as well as English language learners, students with disabilities, and some other students. So that's something that we emphasize at various points in the document. And then finally, charter authorizers, whether it's a state agency or the local school board or some other committee, should monitor enrollment and selection practices with an eye toward identifying disparities that may indicate discriminatory practices. That's critically important. I want to take a minute just to talk about, just to do a little bit of sort of brainstorming about what can be done to bring about accountability. First, of course, is that collect data, obtain data, review data, and our folks should be demanding that the data be accurate and that there be public dissemination of data, of discipline data and selection criteria data, the results of the various charter school processes. Number two, demand that chartering agencies, that is the committee, the state commission, the state board of education, or the school district, depending on what the state law requires in your state, demand that those chartering agencies review discipline disparities at the point at which charters are approved or renewed, or whether there's a check-in or some sort of evaluation, that should become a part of the evaluation process, discipline disparities. Number three, that we work with folks in charter school communities to revise those discipline practices, and we'll talk about some of that a little bit later in the webinar. Number four, file complaints when problems are not being addressed at all or in a timely manner. Now, you can file complaints with the U.S. Department of Education, with the Department of Justice. It may be possible to file a complaint with a local school district or with the chartering agency and with the State Department of Education, or with all of those if need be. I also want to encourage you to use that Education Department May 2014 Dear Colleague letter. It's a very important document. And then finally, change the law. The reality is that charter laws are typically written in such a way that there can only be accountability when there's fiscal malfeasance or continued poor student performance. We need to add to that discriminatory behavior in discipline, selection, the failure to provide services. Those ought to be criteria that apply to charter. And then next, I have given you links to various important documents. I want to turn the mic over to my colleague, my Dignity in Schools colleague, Gina Womack, who's the Director of Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harold. Again, my name is Gina Womack, and I'm the co-founder and co-director of Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. And we are a statewide membership-based organization that works to fight for all children who are involved in or targeted by the juvenile justice system. Next slide. So we got into this work basically because we were hearing from our families that many of our children who were entering into the juvenile justice system, a lot of the kids were entering there through the education system. So in Louisiana, our state discipline law allows for every student to be held to strict accountability. It also allows for teachers that they can suspend children for willful disobedience. And how that looks is that we have not only zero tolerance policies, but we also have no excuse schools. There are specific explanations and expectations for kids to walk in a straight line along a tape on the floor, where students should put their hands, which direction they should turn their heads, and how they should stand and sit. Some of the schools, to control their students, they use what they call SLANT, S-L-A-N-T, which means to sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod, and track the speaker. So students are kept silent for what teachers call level 0 tolerance through most of the day. They do this so they can ensure that children can pass the test. But what they have also done is to take away the critical thinking skills, conflict resolution skills. So the questions we're asking here are we willing to replace high test scores at the expense of raising healthy, happy children? So in Louisiana, what we have seen is the selling points of charter schools in New Orleans were really based on 3 specific points. One was definitely around choice, meaning that parents would have the choice to select the schools their child attends, and teachers and principals could select the schools that they wanted to work with. Flexibility, which allowed charter schools to make free and timely decisions about developing curricula and such. And accountability. The charter schools are able to operate within a multi-tier accountability system. They're supposed to be accountable to parents, to their authorizers, via the performance-based contract, and to the state and the lender. That is supposed to lead to quality schools. So what we've seen in New Orleans, it's been about a decade since a post-Katrina charter school experiment has begun, and the results have been devastating to a community already ravaged by a hurricane, and many of our families are still homeless. Many teachers still experience having no job after they were fired and after Katrina and displaced from their homes, and they've been displaced by mostly students or young folks with less than 5 years teaching experience. And so although we say that, or it has been said, that the charter schools are to be accountable to the community, despite the outcry of the community for having several schools return to the Orleans Parish School Board, what we see now is that we have 100% recovery school district. 100% of those schools are now charter schools. The next slide. So for the 2014-2015 school year, this is a chart of accountability. This is what our governing system looks like. So we have 82 public schools, 6 are under the Orleans Parish Direct Run Schools, 14 under the Orleans Parish School Board Charter. We have 57 RC charters, which gives us 44 governing bodies, 12 charter networks. So we know that this is really very confusing. And again, when we're talking about in New Orleans, we're giving parent choice. What that means is really for us it's a lack of choice when it comes to wanting the best school for your child, because many schools do have selective admissions, leaving parents with no real choice. So really, to put that another way, we see that there are probably about 18,000 seats that are open in Orleans, the A and B rated schools, which means that we have about 45,000 students trying to get into those seats. And that's according to the NPR report around the end of neighborhood schools. Next slide. So what you see here is very disturbing. The 2012-2013 school year, we had 17 charter schools that had suspension rates above 20%. 6 of those charter schools had rates above 45%. And go to the next slide. So what we have really is, although you will hear folks talk about the fact that New Orleans has, we've raised the bar, right? And so that we have, we're at a C overall student performance score. But really what has happened is that our superintendent has actually changed the grading scale. So if the same rules would apply in 2012 to 2013, we would have had 15 schools that would have received a D instead of a C. 5 schools would have received an F instead of a D. And basically, we would be still looking at that we're rated as a G opposed to what they're saying could be that we have a C rating because of the way that they're looking at the student, the scores, the performance scores. So what we're trying to do here in New Orleans, you can go to the next slide. Because we've done some work around trying to hold charter schools accountable, but also changing the student discipline code, and it was that law was vetoed by the governor a couple of years ago, we have to go individually and work with each of those individual schools that you've seen on the chart to be able to make a difference. So what we've done is develop an MOU. We were going to send it out, but we understand it was a little bit too large to send. So Fernando will send that out to you guys later. And we looked at all of what putting together a moratorium could look like and develop an MOU, which of course it can be manipulated to your own needs, because we're going to be working with some of an alternative school here in New Orleans, and we're hoping to develop relationships with some of the individual schools, maybe even some of the charter networks, to be able to get them to help develop a moratorium on suspension. And we're hoping that if we have 1 or 2 successful years with working with the schools, specifically one of an alternative school that gets the majority of the schools that have children that have been suspended and expelled, that we would then hopefully change our governor's mind, or the new governor that comes on board, and see that there's a better way to work with children. You don't have to suspend and expel them. You can utilize the mandates that are already in place, like positive behavior support, the conflict resolution, and working within the community to keep kids in schools, because the communities have a vested interest in their kids. We've also looked at developing what we call a Parents in Leadership project, and that is also to give the parents the tools that they need to work with children that might have challenging behaviors, but also so that they will know that their schools are supposed to utilize these evidence-based practices, and that they can hold their schools accountable. And lastly, we have developed what we call a People's Data Campaign, because like Harold indicated earlier, a lot of times children are being counseled out, and the schools are not actually counting attrition rates. So we're hoping that by collecting the data from the individuals themselves, we will have enough information that would then compel our state legislators to look at these laws again, to really work with us around the charter school accountability guidelines that the Dignity Schools has put out, and to really look at holding these charter schools more accountable. So that's pretty much all I have. If you guys have questions, I'll definitely be happy to answer them later. Thank you for listening. And so now we'll turn it over to Rachel, who will introduce herself.
Thanks, Gina. My name is Rachel Broder. I'm a law student at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I am the current program director of the School Discipline Advocacy Service, which just, because it's a mouthful moving forward, I'm going to refer to it as SDS. So SDS is an entirely student-run volunteer organization. It's made up of Penn and Temple law students who advocate for Philadelphia School District students and Philadelphia Charter School students at discipline hearings. So we attend transfer hearings, suspension hearings, and expulsion hearings. SDS has existed for a couple of years now, but last year we saw an enormous increase in the number of cases that we were getting. And with that increase, we saw an increase in the number of charter student cases we were getting. So because of that, we applied and received member support from Dignity in Schools campaign, which really launched a kind of mass charter project within our organization. And apologetically, I am not the person who spearheaded that report. Her name is Mary Kate. She is in class right now, so I am presenting on her behalf. But Mary Kate undertook this massive research project last year where she attempted to survey all of the charter schools in Philadelphia, which proved very difficult. So ultimately, she ended up surveying about 64 schools. And of those schools, only 31 had published discipline codes on their website, which made it really difficult. And then within those 31 codes, some were incomplete, some were unable to be downloaded, and some were only accessible through extensive online searches. For example, one of them, Mary Kay, was only able to find by looking at the FAQ section, which is kind of an illogical place to put a student code of conduct in somewhere that a parent or guardian may not think to look. So in looking at these codes, these 31 codes, Mary Kate identified 4 key areas of concern, and I'll talk at the end a little bit about why they're particularly concerning to us as advocates. The first is that of those 31 codes, only 4 of them were translated into another language. And in juxtaposition, the School District of Philadelphia's code is translated into 9. So one of these charter schools that Mary Kate looked at has a student population that's 27% English language learner, and that code of conduct is only translated into English, which is incredibly difficult for a parent or a guardian at home who perhaps doesn't speak English as their first language. The second key concern, and really the key for us, I think, is that many of these codes include vague and overbroad terms. So there would be something like disruptive behavior in the code of conduct, and then there's no explanation of what disruptive behavior is. So it's really impossible for a student or a guardian to sort of control themselves and figure out what to do in a classroom so that they're not doing any of those disruptive behaviors. And Mary Kate includes in her research an example of a really great description of disruptive behavior, which would look like throwing objects, leaving class without permission, sleeping in class, putting your hair on the desk, talking while others are talking. And she just didn't see that in a number of these codes that she looked at. The third concern is that many and most of the codes that she found did not include any language about due process guarantees. So in the School District of Philadelphia's code, there is a very detailed explanation of due process guarantees under Pennsylvania law. And then they looked at the charter codes, and that just was not true within them. And for those that did include due process, they would maybe only include a couple of sentences about an expulsion and nothing about a suspension or what would happen in a transfer hearing. And as someone who's worked with a number of families in preparing for these hearings, it is very frustrating and stressful to not know what is going to happen to you in a hearing, and if there are going to be witnesses, and if things are going to be read about you, and what you should have gotten in the mail ahead of time. So that's a large area of concern for us. And then the final is that I think all of the code of conduct that Mary Kate looked at failed to explain Act 26, which is a law here which says that if a student brings a weapon to school, they are to be expelled. And on its face, that looks like a zero tolerance rule, but really there's room for discretion in there, and there's case-by-case consideration, but none of the codes say so. So a parent who has a child who is receiving notice that they're going to be expelled for a weapon thinks that they're absolutely going to be expelled without knowing that there is some wiggle room. So at the end of her research, Mary Kate put together a model code, and this model code is based on, sorry, I forgot to say next slide, Fernando. And then, so in Mary Kate's model code, there are a couple of things. And some of the provisions in there come from the Dignity in Schools model code. Some of the provisions come from a few of the better codes that Mary Kate saw here in Philadelphia. And the plan is for us to work with a couple of these schools in reforming their codes. So just to give you an idea of what it's like on the ground here in Philadelphia advocating for charter students and charter hearings, our number one problem has been these vague terms. So we've had a couple of codes that exist, and we can find them, and then we'll Google them and look for how they define some of the actions that they're accusing students of doing, and then there's no explanation of them. So we go to a hearing, and we have no idea what the school is going to say about what this child did. Or perhaps in the expulsion letter, they'll have said that the student committed, X number of demerits, but then there's no explanation of a demerit system in the code of conduct. And it's very, very disconcerting and hard to prepare a family for that when they're going into the hearing. And a success story is that actually just last week, we had just that situation where a school had a very vague code of conduct, and we went to the hearing, and our advocate said on the record, your code is impossible to read. It's very difficult for the family to know what's happening here. You've listed that this student has committed 42 demerits, but we don't know what those demerits are or what that is there. And the CEO of that board of the charter school said, you're right, this is unfair. We're going to keep this child in school. We're not expelling them, and that's like a really big win for us because it has not happened in most of our charter cases. So I think that's where we are now, and as I said, we're trying to work with more schools, and we're particularly trying to work with the charter office here in Philadelphia, but it's been an interesting and difficult battle thus far. So thanks very much for listening, and now I'm going to turn it over to Liz for questions.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all of our presenters. We're now going to open it up for the question and answer period, and as a reminder, there are two ways that you can ask a question. You can type a question into the question box that shows up in your control panel, and I can read it out loud, or if you'd like to ask a question over the phone or through the internet, you can raise your hand, and there should be a little hand icon in the upper left corner of your control panel. So I have a couple questions that have come in through the question box, so I'm going to ask one of those now, and then if you're interested, please raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask a question. So one question I have is, have you been able to do Public Records Act or Sunshine Act requests in order to get data on the charter schools in your community? Is there anyone who'd like to answer that question?
Well, this is Harold Jordan in Philadelphia. Yes, it is sometimes possible to get it that way. However, we've had a problem in Philadelphia of getting charter schools to respond to any public records access, public records under the public records law. And so Philadelphia charter schools have been, in recent years, notoriously bad about giving you any response. But in some cases, you can get that kind of data from the charter schools or the charter networks. Another source of data is the civil rights data collection. The civil rights data collection covers not just traditional public schools, but it also includes charter schools. And all of the charter schools in Philadelphia have submitted some data to the civil rights data collection, which is available through the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education, free online. Doesn't mean it's accurate. You have the same problems there as you have with other schools, but that data is available.
Are there any other presenters that would like to answer that question? Okay. I see a couple hands raised, but if you called in by phone rather than the internet, I'm not able to unmute you until you enter your audio PIN. So if you see an audio PIN somewhere on your control panel and would like to enter that, then I should hopefully be able to unmute you. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask another question that's come in over the question box. So we have one question for Gina or anyone else. Have advocates ever filed a compliance complaint or lawsuit against schools with the SLANT policies from a special ed or disability rights perspective? It seems like students with ADHD or similar impairments are highly likely to violate these policies and thus be disciplined or pushed out.
Hi. Specifically around that particular issue, I'm not 100% sure, but there are groups. There are lots of groups that are doing lots of different work in New Orleans around the charter school issue, and there are some complaints that are being filed around access, and there are some, Southern Poverty Law Center has filed a lawsuit around special education, so I'm sure all of that is included. So yeah, there are a couple of lawsuits that are happening. I mean, there are lots of different lawsuits that are happening in New Orleans.
Any other speakers that know of a lawsuit around that particular policy?
There may also be complaints with the Department of Education or Department of Justice.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They're sitting on a lot of complaints. I don't mean to suggest that they're not acting on all of them, but a lot of complaints have been filed about discipline matters. A good number of them are about special education matters.
Great. Okay, thank you. I saw that Richard Cohen had your hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, oh, thanks a lot. I was just wondering about NOLO and why they were just looking at PBIS and not restorative justice.
No, I did say that we were also looking at restorative justice, conflict resolution. So it's not just PBIS. There are several, yeah.
Okay, Gina. Well, thank you.
Yeah, there are alternatives. I'm sorry if I didn't indicate that clearly. What I think I did, what I was trying to indicate is that for our organization,
right,
we are looking at training parents on positive behavior support. There are other organizations that are versed that we partner with that are doing the restorative practices and different things like that that they're using in the different schools and training parents on. For our organization, we really try not to, do work where work is already happening, but we will definitely work in conjunction with different organizations. So specifically, because we were looking at being able to train our parents, and that was what they specifically made a request on. And so following what they wanted, we chose to stay on PBIS and then send our parents to other trainings with other organizations if they're interested in doing that. But the law that we passed in 2010, Act 137, definitely required that the teachers and mandated that teachers get the training in PBIS, conflict resolution, and all restorative practices.
Okay, good. Very good. Thank you. I know the Rethinkers have been doing good work.
Yeah.
On this area. Yeah.
Right. They've been doing awesome work, as well as a couple of other groups around restorative justice.
Good. Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, Richard. I'm going to share another question that has come in through the question box. What suggestions do you have for members of charter school boards to support these initiatives? What measures or steps can they take to hold the charter school management company responsible for living up to these standards? Anyone that wants to jump in about what charter school boards in particular can do?
I guess there's a couple of things I would say. This is Harold in Philadelphia. Goes back to what I said earlier. Charter schools are not exempt from federal civil rights laws. And so if I were a charter school board member trying to sort of bring about change in the direction of more accountability, I would look at the federal discipline guidance. I would look at the Dear Colleague letter specifically from the Office of Civil Rights to charter schools that addresses charter schools and tells them what some of their responsibilities are under law. And so if I were a charter school board member, I'd say, hey, can we compare our policies and procedures with what the government is saying is federal civil rights law? That's one starting point. And that includes reviewing codes of conduct, reviewing admissions practices, and I would say services to students with disabilities, I think, are three areas that I would focus on.
And I think that I would add to that, along with all of those things, I would also stress that having parents or people whose children attend those schools, a good number of those people to participate on the board, and even encouraging parent groups and listening sessions, I would really encourage that as well.
This is Rachel from Philadelphia. I just wanted to second both of those, and just based on our work, to really think about the audience of a charter school discipline code and who's reading that code, and how you can explain things so that someone going into a discipline process knows what to expect.
Thanks, everyone.
I also want to remind folks that the Dignity in Schools model code addresses the issue of participation. While we didn't focus on that here, that's actually the opening section, and it's quite detailed for DSC's model code. So you can get some ideas there about what to push for.
Thanks, everyone. Another online question I have you found that schools are keeping data about student arrests, and are organizers and advocates working with the Department of Justice or justice systems and charters, particularly around school arrests?
Well, this is oh, go ahead, Gina.
I was just going to say that some schools are keeping the data, and we are definitely able to obtain information from a couple of different sources. Definitely from the Orleans Parish Public Defender's offices and the like. But it's, they're not always forthcoming with the information, so it's kind of a struggle. But for us, if we needed it, we actually have access to the Public Defender's Office, and then we're working with the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative that has all those folks at the table, as well as we have put together a Children, Youth, and Planning Board, and they can gain access of that information.
And I think that's pretty consistent with what we find around the country, that it is hit and miss in terms of getting information directly from charter schools. I would have to say that generally speaking, it's not the kind of thing that many of them monitor, or at least if they do, they don't readily make those records available to folks. Doesn't mean that the records don't exist, and it doesn't mean that you can't get that kind of information directly from the police department or from the school district using a records request. But once again, I would point out that the civil rights data collection also has arrest data in it. It's very general in terms of the numbers of arrests, the numbers of incidents involving law enforcement, but it has those numbers for charter schools. So that's a place to start. Then you can argue about whether that's an accurate reflection of what goes on.
Thank you, Gina and Harold. I also have a hand raised from Daniel Solis, so I'm going to unmute your line if you'd like to ask a question. Daniel, are you there? I can see that Daniel also sent me his email in the chat box, so I will go ahead and read it out. He asked, can the presenters share any experiences with supporting charter schools in reducing push out of LGBTQ and or gender nonconforming youth?
Well, we are in the process of working again with one of the alternative schools here. It happens to be sort of an organization, and they are definitely like one of our partners. So what they have asked us to help them do is to make sure to really look at developing the, utilizing the Dignity in Schools model code, helping them to really look at their model code, and especially ensuring that the policies that they have are in line and with best practices around working with LGBTQ youth. And we also have another organization here in New Orleans that does that work specifically. So, and they're just looking at ways to be able to ensure that youth are not being pushed out of schools unnecessarily.
This is Fernando, and I'm not aware of, at least where I live, that there have been any specific work around reducing the number of LGBTQ youth that have been pushed out of the school system, but I would like to encourage participants to visit the Gay Straight Alliance Network website. They recently released a report on LGBTQ push-outs, but also, kind of look at the model on creating safer schools. And they're doing that through traditional public schools, but I also think that it's a good model to look into and propose it to some charter schools as well. So, there are many examples, around the country of, safer schools, and they have several guidelines on how they can establish those safer schools. And if you email us as a Dignity in Schools campaign staff, we'll be happy to forward that information or to introduce you to some of the Gay Straight Alliance Network staff as well.
Thank you, everyone. I see that Natalie has her hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. Are you there, Natalie?
Thanks, Liz. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks. So my question for Rachel specifically is, when you are working with the students and the parents in the discipline hearings, if just anecdotally, if you hear that they are kind of surprised by what's going on, like the kind of consequences that they're having to face, or if they kind of expected it because it was a charter school, or just kind of how they respond to the situations that they're in and how that makes them think about charter schools.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. That has been our experience across the board, that most of the families and students we're working with, specifically from charter schools, are really surprised by what happens when we enter the hearing room. With the school district of Philadelphia cases, they're pretty consistent. We know what to expect, and we can usually try to explain that to the family beforehand. But the charter schools operate, as their own small entity. So if we haven't worked with that school before, it is really hard to predict what's going to happen in that room because they're all so different. And as Harold said earlier in the presentation, the charter school codes tend to be a little bit more strict and more stringent. So we see very different outcomes in the charter cases, and it can feel pretty bad afterwards for families and for us.
Thanks, Rachel.
And I would just add to that the charter school codes of conduct are more strict in a particular way. That is, that they tend to punish kids for more minor sort of nonviolent offenses.
Yeah.
Thank you. And another question that came in over the chat box is, do people think that the full takeover by charters, as has happened in New Orleans, could happen in other places after similar crises?
I mean, I would say yes, definitely. And it was interesting. We were having a conversation within Dignity in Schools and trying to see if there was some ways that we could look at how to recognize it when it's happening. So, and I don't want to speak and just say that we've decided to do this, but I think we're interested enough to really kind of see if there's some similarities so that we could send some things out to folks to get them prepared, because I know even here in Louisiana, while the takeover has happened in New Orleans, there's some signs that, we know that the charter schools are about to really pop up. And the one thing is definitely when you see the recovery school district popping in. But I would say definitely because the way it happened in New Orleans, again, they're looking at the history of how they did reform. You can clearly see, like when they just sort of added and changed the laws that would make those charter schools really possible here.
Yeah, I would also add to that, this is Harold in Philly, that you're typically up against more than just one group of people trying to start a charter school. It's really, the charter school movement has organized itself into various networks that are well funded. And so, what we've seen happen here in Philadelphia is that they can get a small number of people out to demand that the district, to stand there with signs and demand that the district expand the number of charter schools and lift the cap on charter school enrollment. And so, they've now become more political about their organizing in support of expansion of charters at the expense of regular district schools. So you're up against more than just a handful of people trying to start a school. You have the idea for some kind of a different school or an innovative school or a neighborhood school. You're up against something very different from that these days.
Thank you. And I think we might have time for one more question. Edward had a question. It didn't quite come through in the chat box, so I'm unmuted your line if you would like to ask one over the phone. If Edward's not there, it looked like there might also have been a hand raised from Mary Young. So I'm unmuting your line as well if you have any question you'd like to ask. Okay. If not, I have one final question that did come through on the chat box. It says, what economic impact have the charter schools had on public school funding in your local school districts?
Well, the answer to that is very state-specific. In Pennsylvania, under the Pennsylvania Charter School Law, the brick-and-mortar charters are authorized by local school districts, and the funding allocations come out of the basic budgets of school districts. It directly comes out of those budgets. The cyber charters are authorized by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, although you still have the same kind of budget arrangement. So it's a direct draw on those budgets, but that may or may not be true in other states. The specific arrangements about funding of charters is state specific.
Well, thank you, presenters.
And
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gina.
And from what
Go ahead, Gina.
From what I
Sorry.
understand, ours is pretty similar to what Harold just said. So I didn't have anything really to add to that.
Well, thank you to the participants who asked questions and to our presenters. I'm going to turn it back to Fernando to wrap up the webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, and to all the participants, and I'd really like to thank Harold Jordan with the LCU Pennsylvania, Gina Womack with Families and Friends of Louisiana Incarcerated Children, and Rachel Brother with the School Advocacy Service in Philadelphia for their participation. And you can see in the slideshow that their contact information is here. So you could actually take a quick picture with your phone or write it down. If not, send me an email and I'll be happy to send an introductory email between you and any of the presenters in this panel. We will be sending information after this webinar, and we will make sure that we include the memorandum of understanding that is being developed in New Orleans between FLIC and a school, in charter school right there, in order to explore the implementation of the moratorium on out-of-school suspension. So once again, thank you very much, and we will be sending you information after this webinar and also other invitation for future webinars as well. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon, everyone.